notice. So my name is Nina Carter, and this is the special meeting of the Olympia World Affairs Council. We have a very important and special guest today, Brian Roraff, who will be speaking about the Baltics and about Russia. And what we have first, however, is Ms. Irina Karmanova from the State Department is going to give us a brief description of the State Department and also share a video. And Irina, you probably know about sharing the screen. You should be able to share your screen at the bottom. So before I get started, however, I am going to share the screen. Privilege of the host here. We have the Olympia World Affairs Council. Here you go. And I just wanted you to know that we are a membership-driven organization. And so we hope you enjoy the program, and we'd like you to consider joining as a member. And if you'd like to do that, here is our website down here, olympiawac.org. And we have international, political, economic, cultural, scientific issues that we bring to our forums. And you get to meet other people that are interested in this and talk about it with the folks that come to our events. And you can also support understanding international issues as they relate to the South Puget Sound. We are a fairly old organization. Olympia World Affairs Council has been around for several decades, but the World Affairs Councils themselves were created after World War I to bring enlightenment to our fellow citizens about the world and giving us a bit more education about what's going on around the globe. So anyway, that's my little pitch to encourage you to join the Olympia World Affairs Council. And now I'm going to turn it over to Irina, and she will share her screen, and then we'll come back to Mr. Brian Roraff. Thank you, Irina.
Thank you so much. We're really excited to be here with you all today. My name is Irina. I'm from the State Department's Office of Public Liaison, and our mission is to connect the American public with some of our foreign policy experts like Brian on topics of note. The U.S.-Baltic relationship is really important, now more than ever, and so he'll be able to speak a little to that. Some of our other programs, we engage with not just World Affairs Councils. We work with Rotary clubs, Kiwanis clubs, universities, civil society groups, diaspora organizations, you name it. And so we're really excited to have this program here with you all today. And before I turn it over to you to introduce Brian, I'm going to play a 1-minute long video on the State Department. You all are very much aware of how much we do around the world, but this is a fun little video we like to play before our programs. So please enjoy.
It's a wonderful and complex world out there, filled with challenges and opportunities. That's why America's diplomats with the U.S. Department of State are on the job every day, representing you. We are advancing America's foreign policy interests by uniting our allies, confronting our adversaries, and protecting our citizens. We advance democracy, human rights, global health, and more. We grow markets that create American jobs. We are America's first federal agency, and we're in 190 countries at over 270 U.S. embassies and consulates, serving you. We are the United States Department of State.
Well, thank you so much for your attention, and I will turn it back over to you guys.
Thank you, Irina. Had to get the buttons unmuted, unvideoed, And I'd like to also just mention with that little video, it's important to know that the Department of State is always interested in recruiting for new employees. We actually talked with a fellow from the West Coast who would like to talk with some of our universities in Eastern Washington, Western Washington about candidates. So just keep that in the back of your mind. And maybe most of us are retirees here. So we can talk to our children or grandchildren about that as they make college decisions. And so now back to our regular programming, as we say. Mr. Brian Roraff, let me do an amazing introduction for you. He began as the director of the Office of Northern European, Baltic, and Arctic Security Affairs in August of 22, just this year at the State Department. And he arrived from the embassy in Tallinn, Estonia, where he served as Chargé Affaires from 2019 to 22. He was previously the deputy director of the Office of Eastern European Affairs, the office responsible for US policy on Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus. Prior to that assignment, he served as a foreign policy fellow in the United States Senate and as a special assistant to the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. Other overseas postings included chief of the political and economic section at Yerevan, Armenia from 2012 to 15. He served 2 tours in Afghanistan from 2009 to 2011, first at the Lithuanian-led Provincial Reconstruction Team in Gore province, and subsequently in the embassy at Kabul. And earlier assignments include the Office of Central Asian Affairs in Washington, D.C., and tours in Kiev, Ukraine, and Moscow, Russia. Mr. Roraff received a bachelor's degree from the University of Illinois, go Illini, and a master's degree from George Washington University. He is married with 2 daughters, and we assume living in the Washington, D.C. area somewhere. So, Mr. Roraff, thank you very, very much for joining us today. I'll turn it over to you, and I'll mute myself.
Hi, can everybody hear me? Thank you, Nina. It's great to be here today. I would like to start off by indeed putting in a pitch to look into employment at the State Department, whether as a civil servant or as a foreign service officer. Civil service jobs are listed on usajobs.gov, I believe the website is. And you know, for the Foreign Service Officer Corps, you take the Foreign Service Officer test, and there's information online. It's offered regularly. I have been in now 20 years, and I joke, you know, you sign up, you go for this 6 to 8 week course of introduction and orientation, and then you get to you put a list together of jobs you want to go to, embassies you want to work at, and then they basically take from that list and they tell you where to go. I wanted to learn a language, so all my posts were Chinese, Arabic, or Russian speaking posts. And I happened to get Moscow, and that led down a path that you read my biography. I don't want to go too much back into it, Nina, but I was not necessarily a Russia expert before I joined the State Department, but as you can tell by my biography, whether it's working in Moscow, in Ukraine, or in Washington on Central Asia. I worked also in Washington on Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus, and I just recently came from Estonia. I pretty much, even Afghanistan, every job I've had I've worked on a former Soviet republic or a country that was at one time occupied by Russia and the Soviet Union. So you wake up one day and you're an expert. But anyways, yeah, so the Baltics, near and dear to my heart. As mentioned, I just finished up 3 years in Embassy Tallinn. Officially, I was a deputy chief of mission, which is the number 2 at the embassy, but we did not, for various reasons, American political reasons, we didn't have an ambassador during my time. So I was the Chargé Affaires. I wore those 2 hats of being the chief of mission and the deputy chief of mission. So I went off to Estonia in 2019 before COVID in the Trump administration. And then COVID came, we had a change in administrations, and then the war in Ukraine, the continuation of the war in Ukraine came. So we in the State Department, when we look back at tours, we always like to think we're in a particular location in a consequential time, but it really did seem like a kaleidoscope of my 3 years. And it was an amazing tour. I'm glad to be back, but Estonia is a marvelous spot, and the Baltics they're really great allies. We really have a lot in common, and I'm going to talk about that today. I understand a lot of the focus, understandably, will be on our relationship with the Baltics, but also the Baltics, our relationship vis-a-vis Russia, and they border Russia. They were occupied by they were part of the Russian Empire for between 100 and 200 years, depending on, well, Estonia and Latvia were part of the Russian Empire for about 200 years, and Lithuania probably about 120 bits of Lithuania taken by Russia in 1795. They got their independence, but were then occupied again. So Russia, these are small countries. They live next to a very large neighbor, often a hostile neighbor. And so their foreign policy, almost every bit of it is animated by Russia, by defending themselves from Russia, by making allies to help protect them from Russia. And I'll definitely get to that and talk about it. I'm going to wind up talking about where we're at today with the Ukraine war and Russia. But, I just want to start out by talking about our bilateral relationship, just in general. But then I'd have to go back into history. I'll visit back about the Russian, occupation during the Tsarist times, because it all has impacts today, and it affects policy today and the way the Baltics see the world and how we relate to them. I would just start by saying, on a day-to-day basis, our work with the Baltics, and we just have excellent relationships. We agree on probably 90% of the things that we have to talk about in the relationship. We're countries that we start at a good spot because we have fundamental shared values, human rights, democracy, freedom of the press. We think a lot alike on, when it comes to free trade and things along those lines. In an embassy, we go talk to our counterparts in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs pretty much every day. Various people in our political section or economic section. It doesn't make the headlines, but every day we're getting instructions from Washington to talk about all these different issues across the world, whether it's trade issues or how do we help, achieve peace in Syria, or what do we do about non-democratic regimes in Venezuela, for example. And I always like saying that whenever we walked into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Estonia, 90% of the time we already agreed. When we went in with a request, we knew 90% of the time we were going to be on the same page as the Estonian government, and that's just because we share the same values. There's another way I put it. In the State Department, there are countries you work with to work on problems. So, it's Estonia and the other Baltic countries. There are countries, when the United States, we try to build coalitions when we try to confront some of these problems, whether it's Russia, whether it's trade issues, whether it's Syria or the People's Republic of China, unfair trade practices. We don't want to do this alone. Baltics are some of the first countries we always reach out to start building these coalitions, because we then band together to work on these problems and sort out the problems. And so that's why we use terms like partners and allies with them. Most recently, when I was in Estonia was on the UN Security Council for 2 years. And so Estonia is a small country. In terms of Estonian speakers, there's barely over 1 million. However, every day we were talking about these global problems. Estonia was on the Security Council during the withdrawal from Afghanistan. We did intensive work with them there, and as well as on Syria and in Venezuela, these other issues that I've mentioned. Iran's nuclear program. We talked to Estonia about, and they were always very helpful. Lithuania, of course, in recent years has taken a very strong stance on the People's Republic of China. They have what they call a values-based foreign policy. Again, getting back to our shared values. the Lithuanians have strongly supported Taiwan. They've built relations with Taiwan, which has made the People's Republic of China unhappy. And the Lithuanians also left one of these. It's like a grouping. It's called the 17+1, but what it is a format for the People's Republic of China to meet with 17 countries in Eastern Europe. And because many countries have seen the debt trap diplomacy that the People's Republic of China has engaged in, creating dependencies around the world. Lithuania was the first country in this grouping to stand up and basically walk out and say, we just, if you want to engage with us, you need to engage with us through the European Union, not just as a subsection of Europe. So that was a moral stand that they took, and we supported them in that. So this is the kind of relationship we have these days. We disagree, of course. I mean, they're all sovereign countries, and we don't see eye to eye on everything. But that's okay. This is what we do as fellow democracies. We just tell each other when we're not on the same page, and we work where we can. I will say, when we talk about the three countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, we're going to talk a lot about foreign policy and security today. And in many ways, they're a group in that sense. And a lot of that is because of their shared history and shared geography when we talk about security and their location next to Russia. However, they are very different countries, make no mistake. One of the things we did in the Baltics, the deputy heads of mission and occasionally the chiefs of mission, we would have coordination calls. Every 2 weeks, I would talk to my colleagues in Riga, Latvia, and Vilnius, Lithuania. And when we talked about security issues, we were all on the same page. But then when we turned to what we were working on day to day, we were in very different places. We saw the three countries, for example, they all took very different approaches to COVID. And in many ways, how a country approached COVID showed a lot of what their values are. Estonia, for example, was one of the countries, maybe you call it a Northern European attitude, where they really did not want to shut the economy down. So their restrictions were much less than other countries. They kept an eye on hospitalizations and deaths. They were responsible. But they were not as quick to go to quarantines and mask mandates and things like that when compared to the other two countries. But and like every country, they have their internal politics. They have their the parties have their differences over trade issues and balanced budgets and social issues and things like that. And so they're all often in different places at different times. So if I speak about the Baltics, make no mistake, different cultures, different, while shared histories, certainly different bits of history, different languages and different mentalities, and that's great. They have also different styles. I would say the Estonians are very direct. The Lithuanians are very energetic and active, and the Latvians are understated. And I say that I say that as styles that work for each country. There's no one way to do diplomacy. Every country kind of has a profile, and that was my impression dealing with diplomats of the three countries. And working with those diplomats is excellent. They're professional, and they know how to talk to the United States. They have very sophisticated understanding of global challenges. So that's where we get to. They're different, but when we talk a lot on security and when we talk about foreign policy, it's Russia animates everything. And so with this is where I'll do a little deep dive back into history. Might be going over some ground I already addressed, but nevertheless, I think it's useful. As mentioned, it was all three countries were a part of Russia and the Soviet Union, or at least occupied by the Soviet Union. For Estonia and Latvia, they were old Livonia. They were largely taken over by Peter the Great during the Great Northern War. I think Estonia was taken over in about 1710. Their place in the Russian Empire was, I think, officially set out in the Treaty of Neustadt in 1721, but they then became a part of Russia. Lithuania at that time was part of the Lithuanian-Polish Commonwealth, one of the great empires and kingdoms in Central Europe. Went from the Baltic to the Black Sea. There's a famous picture of a Lithuanian Grand Duke who, his horse is drinking, or not drinking, but has his hoofs in the Black Sea down, in Ukraine. It was a great empire. But during the partitions of Poland in the 18th century, but much of what is today Lithuania was taken by Russia in 1795. So you had that entire 19th century up until the First World War. These countries were in the Russian Empire. They all declared independence in 1918, after the Bolshevik Revolution. They fought varying levels of, not revolutions, but anyways, they fought off the Russians. And by 1920, the Russians had essentially recognized their independence, the Russian Soviet Federation at that time. But anyways, it was Lenin and the Bolsheviks. But they all had a year and a half, 2 year long wars. They gained their independence, and they were independent from that time until 1940. So they established their embassies around the world, maybe not around every country, of course, but they built diplomatic relations. But one thing they did, and again, I bring a lot of Estonia with me, so I don't want to speak entirely for Lithuania and Latvia, but at least, in a country like Estonia, they made a choice not to get into entangling alliances. They made a choice to kind of go it alone. That was their strategy, to not make enemies, and it didn't work out well. We established relationships, with the Baltic countries around this time. The Lithuanians and Latvians, they put together, they had their embassies here in Washington. Estonia actually had their legation in New York. It was an office in the Empire State Building. They chose to focus on business issues rather than government to government context. But they had diplomatic staffs in these embassies in the United States. And they had them throughout the Cold War, which I'll get to in a second. In 1939, one defining element of, Baltic history, but also their thinking today in foreign policy, is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. This, of course, is the pact between Moscow and Berlin on the eve of World War II that basically, the protocol to the pact divided up spheres of influence in the East. The Baltics went to Russia. When Germany went into Poland on September 1st, I believe it was about September 23rd that the Soviet Union gave an ultimatum to the Baltics that the Baltics needed to allow Russian troops to be based in the Baltics. And so they didn't have alliances, they didn't have friends, and so they couldn't say no. So the Russians did base their troops there in late 1939. By June and July 1940, the Russians had activated those troops, issued ultimatums, and basically took over and annexed the Baltic states in July. I think it was officially approved in August, but essentially in July 1940, the Baltic states ostensibly became a part of the Soviet Union. I was born in the 70s. I grew up during the Cold War, and I think we all remember when we looked at the maps of Europe and the Soviet Union at that time, there were always dotted lines around the Baltic states, and there was always a little notation that said the United States does not recognize the annexation of the Baltic states. And that was because in July 1940, the acting Secretary of State, Sumner Welles, issued what we call the Welles Declaration. And it was a straightforward statement that said the United States does not and will not recognize Soviet aggression of taking over the Baltic states, and we just don't recognize it. And so to return to those embassies and the legation in New York, they stayed. And I know the Estonian story is that it was a gentleman named Ernst Jaksin who went to New York in the 1930s on a diplomatic assignment. I don't think he realized he would be on his diplomatic assignment until 1993. For almost 55 years. He was the representative of the Estonian government in the United States. So during the Soviet occupation, clearly they were occupied, but the United States, we still held diplomatic relations with the three Baltic states. There was a Baltic and Poland desk officer who worked in the department. They met with these diplomats. The United States set a rule that we would only recognize these diplomats from the Baltic states, those who were accredited before 1940, before the Soviets went in. And so I read an oral history of a Poland and Lithuania desk officer who held that position in the 1970s. And he said that, the United States funded those embassies out of, I believe it was funds frozen during World War II. I forget if it was German or Soviet money. I don't know if we were freezing Soviet funds, but anyways, we by and large funded the embassies. It was, a lot of it was very ceremonial. We issued statements on national days and things like that. But nevertheless, all through the Cold War, we continued to have diplomatic relations. So this is really a cherished document in the Baltics, the Wells Declaration. We just celebrated the anniversary of the Wells Declaration while I was in the Baltics. And each of our embassies, we had great programs built around it. And if you talk to anybody in the Baltics about the Wells Declaration, they will know exactly and immediately what you're talking about. When there's actually a funny anecdote, because the next part is the Baltics reasserted their independence. They restored their independence in 1991. And to show you what the Wells Declaration was, there was a gentleman who eventually became the president of Estonia, Lennart Meri. He was the foreign minister at that time. He was asking why he called up somebody who worked on the Soviet desk, who was responsible for what they called back then the nationalities. These various republics that were not Russian, but were actually different ethnicities. And Lennart Meri called that person and said, "Why hasn't the United States recognized our re-independence?" And somewhat tongue-in-cheek, this gentleman said, "What do you mean? We never recognized the annexation. We've always recognized your independence." So when independence came, they had to build their countries. They had to build their societies. And again, their immediate fear was that their independence would not last forever. A lot of what we hear today about Russia's designs on Ukraine, its imperial ambitions, its desire to rebuild the Soviet Union, the Baltics have been saying this since 1991 when they were independent. This year, we had Secretary Blinken come to the Baltics. He flew into Tallinn, he flew into Riga, and then he flew into Vilnius. Normally, because the secretary is a very busy person, we, for better or worse, package sometimes the three Baltic foreign ministers or presidents or prime ministers together to meet with a senior American official. It's not ideal, but there are resources are finite, time is finite. But this was the first, as we say, bilateral trips by a Secretary of State to the Baltic countries since James Baker went in 1991. Now, Secretary Blinken came out in early March, right after the war began, and his clear message was, "We're the United States. You're our NATO allies. We have your back. We support you." When Secretary Blinken came to Tallinn, I did some research on that trip that James Baker did in 1991, and it was very interesting. I thought it was going to be this big celebratory thing where the Baltic leaders were going to have parades and all that. But in fact, that trip James Baker made in 1991 was actually quite tense. It was in September. It was right after the August coup. And the Balts were dead serious when they said, "We need you to help us now because you see those guys who launched that coup, they're coming back. Russia's going to come back for us. Our independence is fragile." And what is interesting was that, they were right. And many of those feelings that were evinced in 1991, it's still the basis of the foreign policy. The Baltics live next to hostile Russia. Russia, if you paid attention, they clearly were talking before February 24th about how Ukraine is not a country. If you look back in July, Putin put out a long article, thousands of words long, about the history of Ukraine and Russia, and he basically rewrote the history, saying that Ukraine is not a separate people, etc., and so forth. Well, there are other comments that Russians and Putin make too, like Narva, which is a city in Estonia. It's on the border of Russia. He called that great Russian territory, that Peter the Great captured. And so these are the things that come over very loud and clear in the Baltics that we might not hear back here. And so this is a lot of what we do, is to reassure the Baltic states. Now, when they got their independence, there's an unofficial motto that I would use. It's never again alone. And by that, I mean, that choice that the Baltic states made in the 1930s to not get entangled. They recognized that was a mistake. And so they immediately sought to join the EU. They immediately sought to join NATO. And, there was skepticism, especially on NATO membership. But the Baltic states, because these are, to join the EU, to join NATO, there are, there's standards. You need to have a certain set of laws for your economy in the EU. You have to be, you have to get in line with the regulatory and there's also political elements of a country's laws to fight corruption and things like that. So you have to do homework to get into the EU. It's the same thing with NATO. You have to do certain things on civil military relations and line of command and interoperability of military forces and things like that. And in the 90s, especially on NATO, the Baltics were told, please don't focus on this right now. It's very hard. And they were kind of, I won't say brushed off, but there was a lot of skepticism. What the Baltics did was they just went to work, and they got to a position by 2002 that nobody could say no to them. And they were invited into NATO in 2002. They did the same thing with the EU. They attached themselves to these as small states. They realized they need allies, they need support, they need larger entities to help them. But they're also contributors. It's within the EU, the Baltics, they're strong, free trade, low regulation voices. They're very active, on that. They're strong countries on rule of law, which is important. In NATO, they are also, as we say, security exporters. They're not all NATO missions, but the Baltics have been in Iraq with us. As mentioned, I served in Afghanistan. My first tour, I served at what we call a provincial reconstruction team. We had about 30 or 40 of these out in the provinces. They're basically army bases, and but they had a civil military goal. We had a small civilian element, and we would go out and we'd try to help the people, whether it's building schools or helping train judges and things like that. We did that in tandem with the military. The provincial reconstruction team I was on was led by the Lithuanians. And so, I spent a year with them, and they were working to make Afghanistan better. They wanted to be good NATO allies. Provincial reconstruction teams were not cheap to set up. It was a big burden, but the Lithuanians did it. And in a similar vein, for example, Estonia joined the French mission in Mali. I think folks are tracking the difficult situation there. Operation Barkhane to fight terrorists there. So why do Estonian soldiers need to go to Africa? What are they doing? What does that do for Estonian security? Well, it's Estonia showing that they recognize that their NATO allies face threats from all over. As we say, 360-degree security. The threat to NATO is not only coming from the east, it's coming from instability in the south. And so the Estonians, for example, and just like the Lithuanians when they signed up, Lithuanians signed up to go to Afghanistan. It was NATO and allies who they came to the United States aid and assistance after 9/11. And so they're helping us because they want to make sure we will help them if the chips are down, that we will come through with our NATO commitments, which we of course would. So when we get back to Russia, and this is where I'll be a little bit more present-minded. Of course, this is the largest war in Europe since World War II. It's absolutely terrible what Russia is doing. It's the Secretary of State told a story today. He had a press conference, and he was talking about how these Russian attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, and the Russians, when they realized they couldn't beat the Ukrainians on the battlefield, they've been really targeting electrical infrastructure, energy infrastructure across the country. The secretary told a story today about a 14-year-old child who was having open heart surgery. And it's during the surgery that all the electricity goes off, and the doctors had to finish the surgery with the lights on their phones. It's barbaric. It is, I think a lot of people, United States, especially Europe, thought that we were somehow past this kind of barbarism, but we're not, unfortunately. When you talk to Baltics, the Baltic countries, they don't say we told you so, but they will say, we've been saying this for a long time, and they really were saying this. They've always been saying it, but it started in many ways when Russia went into Georgia. Some will tell you it started when Russia went into Chechnya, Chechnya is part of Russia, but you know what I mean. In the mid and late 90s, Russia went to take back those rebellious areas of Chechnya. Georgia in 2008, the Russian invasion. Then there was the Russia fomented, fighting in eastern Ukraine and the taking of Crimea in 2014. And all these times, the Baltic states were saying, your bet on Russia that they're going to be a democracy, part of the harmony of Europe, it's a bad bet. And so when February 24th last year happened, they felt vindicated. It was a grim vindication. But the way they say it is that once everybody woke up to the danger that Russia is, they felt that they were heard. And I will say, when we talk about the Russian war in Ukraine, the Baltics are arguably the strongest supporters of Ukraine in the world. They started giving weapons to the Ukrainians in December, a year ago. I think actually it was, for some reason, it sticks in my brain. It was the week before Christmas last year that the Ministry of Defense in Estonia, they called me over to say, hey, we want to get some of these Javelin missiles to Ukraine. Now, we were able to, and we had to give the permissions because we gave them to Estonia. And I think that got done in late December, early January last year. But the Lithuanians and the Latvians have done it. Per capita, when it comes to assistance given to Ukraine, the Baltics are, I think, 1 and 2, and definitely all top 5. This is because what the Ukrainians are fighting for is real. The Baltics, they understand that you need to, borders in Europe need to be sacrosanct. The border between Russia and Ukraine is a European border. There's no negotiating that away. There's no appeasing of Russia, because what they will do is they will regroup and they will keep coming. And, when we were engaged in this, we kind of call it intelligence diplomacy. The United States was very public about what we were hearing about Russia going into Ukraine, sharing this intelligence, saying we have good intelligence that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. People were quite doubtful of that, or they were very suspicious. But nevertheless, the Baltics, they started supporting the Ukrainians, and were a big reason why the Ukrainians have been able to survive. So anyways, there's a point there I'll come back to, but it keeps escaping me when it comes to the Baltic support of Ukraine. Oh, no, yeah, it's a key point, is that even though folks were questioning whether or not Russia really would attack Ukraine, because when you look at it on the facts, there was no way this was going to be a win for Putin and Russia. The Ukrainians were going to fight back. Now, even the folks who thought that Russia would be able to take Kiev in 5 days knew that, or thought that Russia was going to have an insurgency on its hand for the next 20 years, that it was going to be worse than Afghanistan. The Russians were completely miscalculating, thinking that there was a Russian-loving population in Ukraine that was just being held back by this government. It was a really serious miscalculation on the part of Russia. And so what the point that the Baltics make and others make is that if Putin can miscalculate that badly on Ukraine, who's to say he won't miscalculate that badly on NATO and the resolve of NATO? And so these are the kind of discussions we have in Brussels at NATO and bilaterally on why it's so important to support Ukraine. I will say, when we were going through the intelligence diplomacy and consultations, especially before the war and a little bit in the early stages afterwards, we, the State Department, engaged in very intensive diplomacy in various formats. We actually had 3 lines of effort to head off this war before. We had the US, Russia bilateral channels where we would talk about issues and we would warn Russia directly, don't do this. We had the NATO channel where we would meet the Russians in Brussels as an alliance. We were very proud that through hard diplomatic work, when Russia came to Brussels in, I think it was early February, to put their case in front of NATO allies. The Russians like dividing and conquering and picking off countries. 30 countries got behind the microphone in their time, and they said the exact same thing to Russia. It was an extraordinary display of alliance unity. So we had the NATO channel, we had our bilateral channel. We also had a channel through the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE in Vienna. This is a quite large organization. It captures all the countries of Europe and Central Asia as well. So there's about, don't quote me on this, 48 or 50 countries. But we also, we had a group that was united in condemning Russia and warning them off of the attack. One interesting thing, I raise this because one interesting element of our diplomacy with the Baltics during this time, and especially Eastern Europe, was that we were engaging directly with Eastern European nations on this. We did a lot of consultations at NATO, but there's a format called the Bucharest 9, and these are the 9 countries that go from Estonia down through Poland, through Romania and Bulgaria, Hungary, Czech Republic. It's the eastern flank. And if anybody's read the book by Timothy Snyder, Bloodlands, this is B9 is much of the Bloodlands, and that Timothy Snyder book is about that area in between Russia and Germany that 20th century was just catastrophic. And the problem, the real tragedy of the many tragedies of what happened in the Bloodlands was these were countries where their future was decided, over their head in discussions where they were not at by big capitals, whether it was Munich, or Molotov-Ribbentrop Compact. And so we, the United States, made a conscious decision to engage in diplomacy so that they were not, to reassure them we were not talking over their head, nor were we talking over Ukraine's head. Our mantra on Ukraine is nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And so, it was interesting to me, as I was wrapping up my tour in Estonia during this war, many of the themes of the diplomacy we were doing were so informed in the Baltics by the history, by the Wells Declaration. When we talk about the inviolability of borders of Ukraine and why it was important never to recognize the annexation of Crimea, these are the same principles that were in the Wells Declaration, where we didn't recognize the annexation of the Baltics. The fact that we went out of our way to consult, President Biden called the heads of the Bucharest 9 countries. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, talked to his counterparts. Secretary Blinken talked to his counterparts. One of the reasons we did this direct diplomacy, because we're very conscious of this region and its history, and that these things matter. And diplomacy is not putting out a fire every week. It's informed, by each country's history. And we're the United States. We do things in the open. We do some things right. We do some things wrong. But I have to say, I was quite proud of being part of that diplomacy in the run-up, and since the war began, keeping together the allies and making sure we're consulting fulsomely. The only thing I would end with is that, just as an emblem of support to Ukraine, these Baltic countries, they're taking in tens of thousands of Ukrainian refugees. I think it's up to 3% of the population of these countries at this point are Ukrainian refugees. I remember in Estonia, which is similar in Latvia and Lithuania, there were Ukrainian flags everywhere, but the number of people who took in Ukrainian families, women and children, was astounding. And I remember having a dinner it was some cultural event, and it was all very interesting people, architects, and much more interesting than government people. But they were artists and things like that. One gentleman had 5 Ukrainians at home, a mother and 4 children. And I said, "How long will she stay with you?" He says, "I have no idea, maybe a long time." But they feel this. Ukraine is their fight. The threat that that was made against Ukraine. They feel it too. And so again, to wrap up with where I kind of started, that's what animates the diplomacy. That's why we see the Estonians, the Latvians and the Lithuanians being good NATO members, being good EU members. They share the fundamental values, but this is also crucial to their foreign policy, which at the end of the day is their security. So I think I will leave it there. Hopefully that wasn't too long, but I am happy to answer any and all questions.
Oh, thank you so much, Brian. That was very informative. I'm so glad you focused on the history. And in fact, I put Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands book in the chat there, so people can order it and read it, because that will inform Americans about why and what has happened there over the centuries, in fact. We do have some questions in the chat, and I encourage anybody else that wants to add your questions to the chat, or you can raise your hand and I'll pick on you. But the first one was from Otto. Are you connected with the United States Institute of Peace? And I assume, Otto, you mean the State Department is connected, or Brian himself. United States. Yeah. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I can answer for both. The answer, I mean, there's two answers. Yes and no. That's helpful, I guess.
Well, that's very helpful.
No, in the sense that that is, it's funded by Congress. It was chartered by Congress, and so Congress kind of feels the U.S. Institute of Peace is theirs, which is great. But U.S. Institute of Peace is literally across the street, across 23rd Street from us, and we have a very close relationship with them. Many times, State Department officials will go over there for, we do these excursions out of the State Department there's so many. Sometimes you're chained to your email box and you're answering the last email. But at U.S. Institute of Peace, you can get away from that and think bigger. You can do strategy. You can write papers. And I do remember one of the things that one of the most intense engagements we had was I was the deputy director for Ukraine affairs in 2017 to 19 here in the department. And so this was, and of course, it was after the 2014 incursion by Russia and the snatch of Crimea, but it was before this, egregious war right now. So it was. I don't want to use words like lulls or frozen or anything like that, because people were dying. But nevertheless, it was in this unfortunate stasis, and so we were trying to figure out: is there a way to restart negotiations? How does this happen? And so U.S. Institute of Peace was just very helpful in trying to game some of this out and how would it work. And we have this track 1, track 2, track 3 diplomacy. Track 1 is, I might get my tracks mixed up, sorry. But it's the government to government. It's me talking to somebody behind closed doors, government to government. And then there's the people to people element. We'd always do this track 1.5. There's track 1 and track 2. Yeah, we called it track 1.5, which was, former government officials. We had some former ambassadors involved who would be talking to former, Russian diplomats and maybe think tankers who were closely connected with government. So there was some space for very well-informed government types, but who were not accountable to governments to kind of brainstorm these ideas. And so, anyways, obviously, unfortunately, at the end of the day, Russia didn't want to cooperate, so it didn't go anywhere. But anyways, at least in my world, U.S. Institute of Peace is much broader than that. But at least from my experience, this is how we work with them.
Very good, thank you, and a good question, Otto. And I may follow up with you about possibly getting a speaker from the Institute of Peace. So thank you for that connection. Another question we have from Anders is, what is the mood of the Russian-speaking segment? Oh, and I'll get back to Tony's question in a minute. What is the mood of the Russian-speaking segment of the population in the Baltic states? Have the Russians been doing effective meddling? Russian-speaking segment in the Baltic states, what's their mood?
It's a very good question. And so people understand, in Estonia and Latvia, between 25 and 30% of the population is Russian speaking. The population is much, I think it's 6 to 8% in Lithuania. It's much less. It's tense, and this is really, what's the term, watershed moment, inflection point, turning point. In many ways, our diplomacy as the United States, we would reach out to these communities. We talk to all communities in these countries. We tried to keep geopolitics out of it. We wanted to talk to Russian-speaking Estonians on their own terms. We had many programs to reach out to them, everything from educational programs and English language programs to even more informal things like we have what we call an American Corner, a small center, in these libraries where we have programs, but also English language books. We would offer classes to the grandmas who wanted to learn how to use mobile phones so they could do WhatsApp and take photos and exchanges, with their kids to see the grandkids and things like that, and also do, mobile phone photography, just to build relationships. And so we're working to keep geopolitics out of it. But there is historical tension there, just because of the history. The invasion on February 24th, it's very hard to not talk about geopolitics these days. What we did see in the polling with the Russian-speaking community is that there was a divide within the community in terms of age. Younger Russian speakers, they had more access to, they had access to more sources of information. Many of them had English, unlike their parents and grandparents. Many of them did grow up, studying Estonian in school as well. And so they, as a result, were much more skeptical of Russia's stated aims. They basically, the trust in Putin was kind of low. And it was very different from the older generation, which was buying believing the line that came out of Moscow. And so there's tension within families, there's tension within communities. I don't want to overstate it though. Like we're at a dangerous moment or anything. The Russian-speaking community in these countries, they recognize the value of being in the EU. If you're in the EU, you get freedom of movement. If you are a citizen of these countries, you can and not just have a Russian passport, you can go move and work within the EU. They do see that the roads are better in their countries, many more opportunities, and so there's when it comes to bread and butter issues, there's an appreciation of the values that the EU brings. But nevertheless, they are the Russian speakers. They're of the Orthodox world. They're going to turn to their culture, to Pushkin and Tolstoy, and that's understandable. One step that the Baltic states have taken is that there's taking down a lot of these Soviet monuments. And so this is not popular in the Russian-speaking communities, but the governments have taken the decision, for many of the people in the Baltic states, these monuments are symbols of oppression. They're not, the mementos of liberation that they purport to be. So, anyways, I can only describe kind of the mood. That's what it is right now. We as the U.S. government, we have relationships with all the communities, and I think there was the other element to that question was Russia meddling in the countries. It's because I've served in or worked on all these countries that have bordered in Russia. Russian meddling takes very different forms, and in some countries that have corruption, Russia buys off the local oligarchs. They can buy off half of the parliament. And they buy off the publishers of newspapers. So they have all these levers to push in business, in media, in government, and they can manipulate. Because they want a veto power over these countries' foreign policy. Mission one is never for them to join NATO. In the Baltics are a little bit different. They're first of all the Estonian, Latvian, and Lithuanian populations are very sophisticated when it comes to disinformation. They don't buy it. They live with it. Russian disinformation doesn't work, and so it's they in many ways are, I don't want to say inoculated, but they're pretty sophisticated. So what you see is the Russians don't really try it with the Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian populations. When it comes to the Russian-speaking populations, a lot of them just get their news from Moscow, and so it's not, they're watching the Russian worldview, but there are other countries, like I said, that I've worked on previously. There are very tailored narratives coming out of Moscow about local events, whether it's social issues or politics and things like that. Didn't really see that in the Baltics. Really the one big threat that the Baltics looked for, it was a very conventional military threat. If there's a confrontation between NATO and Russia, it could lead to a Russian incursion into the Baltics. Anyways, it's an interesting question. It's hard to answer because things are in flux, but that's how these issues land in the Baltics, at least in my experience.
And thank you, Brian. Very interesting observation, but that does relate to the other question from Tony about what is the press of the Baltic nations saying about the Ukrainian war. And you just mentioned that a lot of Russian speakers get their news from RTV, from Russian television, but what is the Baltic press saying about the Ukrainian war?
Well, the local language press is, clearly, condemns Russia. Let me put it this way, one of the best lines I heard in Estonia was that, inflation in Estonia going back to April is 20%. It's the highest in Europe. It's really, it's eye-opening. It's the number 2 story in the country, 20% inflation. Number 1 is Ukraine. And so it's, so the press is very much, focused on Ukraine, supporting Ukraine, condemning Russia, uncovering Russian, misdeeds and atrocities in Bucha and the like. For the local language, for the Russian language press, it's like I said, much of the news that goes to the Russian-speaking population comes from Moscow, so that's the narrative they're getting. But there are, some of the local Russian-speaking press sometimes doesn't directly address it. But also one thing we're trying to do as the State Department is to support that independent media that left Russia and moved to the Baltics. So there are some elements there, Radio Free Europe, Medusa, these outlets that have relocated to the Baltics. And so we're trying to support them, to be able to provide news to Russia that is not the state narrative. So that's essentially what the media landscape looks like. It's hard. It's when I lived in when I worked in Ukraine, it was 2005. This was 9 years before Crimea and the Donbass started, and 17 years before this war. Even in 2005, the Russian press was beaming into eastern Ukraine that anybody in Ukraine who spoke Russian was in danger of physical violence. And they ran stories about how if you lived in Kiev and you spoke Russian, you were being beaten on the street, which was ridiculous because actually, if you tried to speak Ukrainian in Kiev, people had trouble speaking Ukrainian. They were all Russian speakers. This has since changed, right? There's a national awakening in Ukraine. Many people switched to Ukrainian, they're dropping Russian. But my point is that this was a well-formed narrative that Russia had been using for a decade or more before they actually went in. And so this is why the media landscape is so tough. It's many folks believe it. And so this is why it's such a high priority for us to get the truth and good journalism there, but why it's also very hard to change minds from offshore.
And sort of a follow-up question on media, can you comment on what has happened recently to TV Rain in Latvia? And maybe for our participants today, a quick description of TV Rain, which I believe was in Moscow, and now the folks had to get out of Moscow and come to Estonia, and or Latvia, excuse me. Can you comment on what happened to TV Rain?
Yeah, what I can say is, clearly we're watching that closely. We, as I've said, we think that it is important that there is an independent Russian media that's able to put roots down outside of Russia to continue to do journalism that is actually the truth. The Latvian government has suspended the license or revoked the license. TV dozhd, as we say, TV Rain. Dozhd is rain in Russian. They're considering whether to appeal. We're on record with the local governments about the need for this independent journalism. We are in touch with TV Rain about the situation too. I can't say much more than that, That's pretty much where we're at. You know, our embassy in Riga has good contacts with a lot of these, as well as in Vilnius. They have good contacts with these journalists in exile. It was, and the reason why the Latvians pulled the license was because a journalist who appeared on TV Rain essentially, you know, praised TV Rain reporting that showed the poor, you know, equipment situation, the poor clothing situation of Russian soldiers in Ukraine. And he said that because of our reporting, essentially, we were able to help the Russian army in Ukraine. That's not, you know, that's not a message you want to be spreading in the Baltics. Now, TV Rain fired that journalist. They did apologize, but it really led to a public outcry of, you know, they don't want these organizations supporting Russia. But nevertheless, as I said, free press, independent Russian media, very important. We're supporting it, you know, financially, spiritually, you know, in capacity building, and we're in contact with the parties.
Yes, thank you, Brian. Thank you. And I think we've already addressed Jean McGregor's question about people that are Russian having ties and sort of mixed feelings about how to react to all of this. So it is just 1:02 our time. It's 4:02 your time. We realize you all had to schedule this on East Coast time. And before we close out, I wanted to thank our program chair, Jane Stone. She manages all of the programs for our Olympia World Affairs Council, but in particular, John Gray, who has his grayed out box there. He has been in touch with Irina and Brian to set this whole thing up. And we just appreciate the work that you do to help us bring good speakers to the Olympia area. So thank you, Brian. Thank you, Irina, John, Jane, and all of my fellow board members. And we will be posting this again tonight at 7:30. We'll replay it. And then it will be on our website, also on YouTube, so folks can see it there too. So Brian, your words will go further than just right now. And I appreciate the fact that you let us do that. Thank you so much. And I don't know if there are any other messages. There's a lot of thank yous coming in on the chat. So once again, Brian, Irina, appreciate your time and effort to bring all this together. And don't forget to go to our website, Olympia World Affairs Council. Join up, help us support these kind of excellent speakers. So goodbye, everybody. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. It was an honor.
Thank you.